Welcome to the last book adda of the year, and I think everyone here understands what an adda means.
One more book next Friday.
Oh, there is. Oh, I'm okay. Okay, so this is a penultimate book adda, not the final one. Everybody here perhaps knows what an adda means, but nonetheless, it will help to translate it into social science humanities language, which is a site for collective deliberation. It can be given more culturally specific meaning, but that's how we envisioned our book adda series. This is probably its 10th year. We also thought of mehfil as an alternative, but doesn't work. Adda is better, yeah?
It is.
Adda is better.
Musical connotation.
Yes. Romila Thapar was trying to convince me that it should be a mehfil. So, but I resisted, yeah. So we, in our book adda series, we normally read a very important recent book and discuss it. Learn from it, and hopefully the commentary takes the argument forward. So it's in that spirit that we have organized Sandipto Dasgupta's Legalizing the Revolution. And you can see I've read it rather well, right? All these. India and the Constitution of the Postcolony. In political science, which is my parent discipline, the problem of movements becoming governments, coming to power, becoming governments, that is quite well researched. The problem that this book addresses, in one sense, in one generic sense, falls in that category of analysis, but in another sense is very different. It's not about just any movement coming to power. DMK, Dravidian movement coming to power in Tamil Nadu, right? India against corruption coming to power in Delhi. It is about a freedom movement heavily supported by or heavily anchored in mass mobilization coming to power, and the idea of governance had to be given a constitutional form. Now, this is quite different from regular, what is called regularly a movement coming to, what is regularly called coming to power and then thinking about governance. So there's something about the founding moment of a new republic, of a newly independent country, that gives this book's analysis of movements becoming governments its special analytic and conceptual charge. And to use his own language, to cite that, how does the transition from the tumult of popular anti-colonial politics to the ordered calculus of post-colonial governance come about? The tumult of popular anti-colonial politics is the background, led by Mahatma Gandhi and Congress Party, to the ordered calculus of post-colonial governance is what the Constitution is supposed to provide a framework for, at least And it says quite a lot more. The book says quite a lot more, and there'll be discussion of that. Not just a framework for that, but quite a lot more, because the idea of a transformational constitution is quite central to the book. It's not simply a framework, but it gets into the details of governance. The Constitution gets into the details of governance in a very, perhaps for the first time a constitution does that, though the legal theorists here, the constitutional theorists here will know more about it than I do. And the key analytic issue, then this is the background, the key analytic issue is, must mobilization be curtailed or truncated? The mobilization that brought independence about, must that be curtailed once that anti-colonial movement comes to power? Elsewhere, you could say that in China, for example, it was not a typical anti-colonial movement, but yes, a revolutionary, heavily mass mobilized, quote unquote, movement came to power in 1949 on 1st October, and the mobilization continued. Sometimes the idea of permanent revolution is used for a transition of that sort, revolution becoming a permanent feature of the polity. So that much about, substantively about what we're discussing today. You can see it's a very important matter, and therefore we are very happy to welcome Sandipto Dasgupta here to discuss his work. He is an assistant professor at the New School and was at Ashoka, if I recall correctly, before that, with a PhD from Columbia. And I think this book is probably based on, of course, it's very different from what must have been his PhD dissertation. But if this is his first book, then this has at least roots in the PhD dissertation completed at Columbia. The book has received already a lot of attention and major awards, including the first Francine Frankel Book Award from APSA, from the South Asia section, a newly constituted South Asia section, the Econ S Prize for Outstanding Book in Public Law, and Bernard Cohn First Book Prize from Association of Asian Studies. Sandipto, I'll introduce the three commentators, discussants a little later. This is not exactly a mahfil of political theorists. There are one legal scholar here and one comparative political scientist here. So we have the empirical side in our life in a different way, but there will be two other political theorists who will be commenting on him. And I'll introduce them later. Uday Mehta, who will go last, Nazmul Sultan, who will go first, and Rohit Dey, a legal scholar who will be second to go. Now, the author will have up to 30 minutes. We enforce it very rigidly. Yeah. and the commentators will have up to 15 minutes. And then we will open up for discussion in this very intimate setting of an adda. Thank you. Let's welcome Sandipto Dasgupta.
Thank you, Ashu, for organizing this, for having me here. I also want to thank for Uday, Rohit, and Nazmul for doing this. I should say that one can really not imagine a better panel for this. I didn't have a hand in choosing them, but I couldn't imagine a better panel because I think they have written collectively the kind of interventions on the topics of the book, which I respect the most, really. So it's really is a pleasure to be able to discuss it with them, and thank you for, it's an end of semester for coming. So what I will do, I won't take more than, I will take less than half an hour because I want to hear what they want to say. So I'll just lay out the book, the very, very outline of the book as briefly as possible. It's unfortunately a long book. So I'll do my best to make it just the bare outlines of it so we can have a conversation. So as Ashu was mentioning, the starting point of the book is institution making after decolonization, right? So if you think about decolonization as a historical process, it has its two parts, right? It's unmake the empire, and then you make a new post-colonial order, right? And the second part, and that task, which is what this concerns the book. And sort of the empirical or the archival side of that is the Indian constitution making process. And I read the Constituent Assembly debates in India as kind of an archive of contemporaneous reflections, right, on this quite fraught task of translating anti-colonial aspirations, let's say, the struggles, into post-colonial institutions, right? This is not a normal way of reading or a usual way of reading the Constituent Assembly debates. Traditionally, people read the debates as a way of sort of garnering some kind of principles or broad normative, guidelines. What do Indians think of rights? What do Indians think of democracy? And I think that distinction, the way I read it is not common, is because traditionally in India, and I would say other places as well, there has been kind of a distinction between, let's say, constitutional studies or constitutional theory and between study of, say, decolonization or post-colonial politics, right? So the first one is often done by lawyers. It's more of a juridical normative exercise. And then the second part is done by social scientists and historians, right? And it's questions of, socio-political development and so on. So the major sort of methodological and also narrative sort of, claim of the book is that these two strands need to go together and they have to speak to each other and they need to go together. To put another way, the constitution making process can tell us something about decolonization, theorized decolonization, and conversely, the history of decolonization can tell us something about the specificity of the post-colonial constitutional form, right? So, and I try to speak to both these threads, so what constitution can tell us about decolonization and vice versa, in the time I have. Okay. So now, the Indian constitution generally, and it's a much written about topic, and it generally has a kind of a familiar autobiography. And the autobiography is a juridical one, right? It's sort of, it takes us through these different, acts, British acts, reforms, settlements, negotiations, petitions, to this sort of final constitutional text, right? And as I said, my goal is to actually situate it not within sort of a sequence of legal texts or juridical developments, but within the sort of this much more tumultuous development of the anti-colonial movement, right? And situate the constitutional there. And so in that sense, the anti-colonial for me is not just something which came before the constitution, right? It is the kind of the conditions, the structuring condition of what the constitution was to be, right? And so in that sense, it's a post-colonial constitution, a very specific temporal sense, right? It can only come after the colonial, right? Now, in the, So I try to schematize the anti-colonial movement in three parts, very, very generally speaking. So the first part is sort of, it starts in late 19th century, what Chris Bailey calls the constitutional liberal tradition, and this is basically the the urban elites in the Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. They are not demanding the end of empire, but they're demanding more rights and less discrimination within the empire, right? Kind of asking the empire to fulfill its own sort of liberal promise. And the form they take for this is, things like editorials or petitions or legislative sort of, making representation of British Parliament and so on, right? Now, after the First World War, across the colonized world, this changes, right? Including in India, of course, with Gandhi. And the shift now becomes from the constitutional to the popular mobilizational front, right? So with the Gandhi mass movement in 1919. So there's two shifts, again, both in the content and of the demands and the forms. And the content of demands now shifts from more rights or discrimination to sovereignty, right? It eventually becomes, by 1920s, late 1920s, questions about self-determination and sovereignty and the end of British rule, right? And in terms of the form, because Gandhi is now called extra unconstitutional by many of its peers, is because the form becomes much more about massive mobilization in the streets. It's not so much about councils or internal institutions, but this kind of this presence of mass politics, right? And it's very important because what the Gandhian movement does is it prefigures this kind of Indian public, right? Indian people who can actually sort of govern themselves. They are actually politically capable subjects, and not just what the British claim, that don't have political capacity, but you can demonstrate that through this organized form, right? And so, sorry. And so what you get is Congress becomes, therefore, this party of mass politics, right? And that's why Congress becomes this party, arguably the single largest mass party in history, right, in terms of just membership and its reach. However, every mass mobilization also at the very same time radicalizes, right, the people, progressively as the movement mobilizes, right? And what happens is the demands go beyond the Congress-sanctioned demand focusing on the colonial state to include much more social demands, and often against other Indians, like, say, moneylenders or landlords or factory owners, right, who are not British. And this shift and this kind of expansion, which really kind of takes on after the Great Depression in the 30s onwards, right, creates now then anxiety in the minds of the Congress elites. So what you get out of this, well, theoretically speaking, right, is a kind of an interesting bind, which is, on one hand, it is because of the popular mobilization is why Congress is now a credible party claiming power, right? And at the very same time, that's the success of that mass mobilization is what creates anxiety in them. So it's kind of this bind of simultaneous dependence and anxiety on popular politics, right? And I think I see this particular tension, this bind, is kind of quite fundamental in understanding what the Constituent Assembly does, right? So, and the word which really kind of gives us this sense is the word revolution, which appears a lot in the Assembly. Now, in sort of conventional constitutional theory, the revolutions and constitutions have a particular sequence, right? And think of the United States, for example, which is that revolutions throw away the old order. They generate the principles of new norms for an order. And you have the constitution making process, which sort of formalizes those norms. And then you have the everyday life of normal constitutional politics, right? So you have, revolution followed by constitution, right? But when the Indians talk about revolution in the Assembly, they never talk about it as a past event. It's actually kind of a striking thing if you think about it, given how large Congress's sort of mass base was. No congressperson ever talks about themselves as revolutionaries or talk about what they're doing as revolution, right? Never mentioned. Instead, the revolution they talk about in the Assembly is a possible future occurrence, right? And that future occurrence has two possible images. Right. One, which we can call the feared revolution. This is the idea of a kind of social unrest and mass insurrection because of issues of inequality, injustice, on the land question, caste question, and so on. Right. And then what they want on the other hand is what they call a desired revolution, which is kind of a gradual, planned social transformation, right? What we can call a planning and development. Right. And the idea is that and these two sort of revolutions have their respective revolutionaries, right? For the first one is the masses, right, the feared revolution. And the second one is sort of the experts and planners and administrators, right? And the goal for the Assembly is to supplant the first one, the possibility of social unrest, by successfully doing the second one, a gradual planned transformation, right? So in other words, what the Assembly's task they see for themselves is accomplishing this sort of revolution without a revolution, right? A social transformation, but without the disorder and the unrest which accompanies this transformation, right? And the Constitution has to be the institutional architecture that facilitates that. And that's where the title comes from. It has to legalize the revolution, right? Now, this constitutional form, which comes out of this particular task of legalizing the revolution, I call it, as Ashu mentioned, transformational constitutionalism. And sort of a one-line definition of that is it's a constitutional form which is oriented around change rather than constraint. Again, if you think about constitution in our sort of in a familiar way, we think of constitution as limits, right? Limits, checks and balances, preserving rights or preserving some order. It's kind of backward looking, right? To preserve something existing. While the transformational constitution the Indians were writing is forward looking. It's about anticipating things, engineering things, right? Facilitating things, mediating things in the future, right? Now, however, this project of bringing together law and revolution, right, has a tension sort of inherent to it, which is that law and revolutions don't sit well together, right? Revolutions don't follow laws, and laws don't authorize revolution, So bringing them together as uneasy cohabitation meant to kind of reconceptualize both the nature of law, namely the Constitution, and the nature of the revolution, namely the project of transformation, right? And that's the kind of the second half of the book actually goes through different institutions to show how this peculiar tension and the particular set of tasks reshapes these institutions. So for example, just to give an example, like I talk about, say, universal franchise and parliamentarism. The question there is, how can you do developmentalism through parliamentary form? Because normally developmentalism is an executive function generally, right? Or there's a chapter on rights and repression, as I call it, which is to, if it's not about limiting state power, what's the different idea of rights which come out of that, right? And how it's linked to state repression, which has been a continuous feature of Indian politics. Right. There's a chapter on property and labor, and the question there is, can actually law rewrite property relations and labor relations, right? What are the limits of that and possibility of that? And lastly, there's a chapter on lawyers and judiciary, which is an interesting puzzle, which is that the constitution makers want to make sure that lawyers and judges don't come anywhere near the transformational project. Nevertheless, the lawyers and judges find their way back into it, right? And that's the kind of the battle that chapter kind of focuses on. So I can talk about any of these things in more detail in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But what I want to do for the rest of the talk today is kind of focus on one major argument, which I think is most opposite to the panelists we have and to their own work as well, which is the argument about how the Indian Constitution tries to institute popular sovereignty without popular politics, and what are the consequences of that, right? So we all know that all like Indian Constitution, like the American ones, starts with this the first person authorial declaration, right? We the people. Now, it's not really a big reveal to say, oh, well, it's a fiction. The people are not really actually the people. That's not in every constitution everywhere. The empirical people and the authorial people are not the same. It can't be identical. That's not necessarily an interesting thing to say in itself. What's more interesting is, and what I do try to look at, is in what way are they not corresponding and to what extent are they not corresponding? Right. And to specific to India, the question for me is, what is the distance between anti-colonial popular political form and idioms and post-colonial institution? Right. And I argue in the book that distance is analytically significant, that it is deliberate, it's not a result of some chance occurrences. And lastly, that it's immensely consequential for how the post-colonial political life would be structured. Right. So let me just say a bit on each of these things. Right. So as I said, popular politics was the condition of possibility for Congress coming to power or for end of empire. And it's not just empirically because there was popular mass mobilization, the British had to leave. It's also so conceptually. Because empires can actually grant you many different things. It can actually give you more rights. It can give economic development. One thing no empire can give is popular sovereignty. Because the very basis of the imperial claim is that this particular population cannot govern themselves. That's why they have to be governed. So democracy and popular sovereignty has to be and was the core anti-colonial claim, right? It's the heart of anti-colonial claim. So at the same time, however, as you said, the more you mobilize the people, more it gets actually true mass mobilization. You also generate multiple various images of what freedom would mean, what free India would mean, right? And many and most of these images were not sanctioned by the Congress. They're way more expansive, ambitious, radical than what Congress would have sanctioned. So this is the kind of the question about the bind between the dependence. It's so core to the anti-colonial assertion, as well as the problem of controlling it, right? So the point to get therefore is that when I say that the masses are distant from the assembly, or right, they are not present in the assembly, the issue here is not so much that the masses can't participate, they're unable to participate, don't have the capacity to participate, but actually the fear of their capacity, what they can do if they could participate. And just to give a kind of a concrete example of this, that this thing about popular political form is not some kind of normative ascription of mine, right, about direct democracy, radical democracy. In the years, the decade of 1940 is arguably the decade of the most intense mass politics in India's history till date. Right? So you get the Quit India movement, which is the largest mass movement, often leaderless, very radical. Then you have the largest peasant rebellions in India's history in Telangana and in other parts of the country. You have the largest industrial strikes in Indian history in 45 and 46 in Bombay and Calcutta. You have massive student protests, right? When the assembly is meeting, the notion of mass political unrest or popular politics is very tangible. It's very proximate to what they are doing, right? And it's not something I'm normatively ascribing. It's something that is, at hand, so to speak, in the history at the point, right? So in that sense, therefore, we can really say that what the constitution makers try to do, right, by separating popular politics and popular sovereignty is this. The constitution isn't undemocratic, obviously, right? They create pathways for popular participation. What are those pathways? You can think of voting as a primary one. You can think of litigations. You can think of petitions and ways of reaching out to the government or to your representatives. What it doesn't sanction, on the other hand, are actually the forms of mass political participation, which is the most germane to the anti-colonial politics. Think of sit-ins, think of dharnas, think of hartals and strikes, right? Which is the basis of Gandhian politics. Those are the ones which actually are not finds any place, actually quite sort of deliberately excluded from the constituent sort of constitution making process, right? And so this is the kind of the line, this argument is what the critical part of the book sort of follows from this, right? And I will sort of mention what I want to do with what's the critical element of the book, which is, there's a lot of critiques of post-colonial institutions, and generally they take the form of you compare the post-colonial institutions to some metric external to it, right? So you say basically, okay, there's not enough respect for liberal rights, the voters aren't informed enough, the economy isn't developed enough, right? Like, so the system is too corrupt. So it's always the kind of a metric of what's a good institution look like, and then you compare to that. What I want to do in my critical work is to sort of try to derive it from India's own history, right? The history of anti-colonial movement itself. It's not an external metric, but say, okay, if these were the possibilities of the anti-colonial movement, how does that, or does it not, translate to the post-colonial institutions? Right. And this separation of popular sovereignty, popular politics, right? That's the two major consequences of that are done. The critique is done in the same vein. And I'll just mention the two major consequences I want to sort of flag. The first one is what today you can say in India, kind of electoral ethno-majoritarianism, right? And the question is how? Well, as I mentioned earlier, empires don't think that the colonized subjects have political capacity. What they do is they classify into them different groups, social groups, and the argument is that their political subjectivity is just a reflection of the social location. It's religion, caste, ethnic groups, tribes, kinship. All your political self is just a reflection of this given ascribed social self, right? The point of the anti-colonial movement was to say, no, through this collective political process, right? Not only will you change the country, but also you change yourself. Anybody who's been part of any kind of mass politics knows that, right? As you go through it, who you are as a political subject changes. It shifts through this collective process. Right. So in a way, the question of what it means to be Indian canvas up for this kind of political renegotiation through this collective mobilization. Now, the moment you withdraw back from that, so right, as I sort of say, basically when you kind of go back to some electoral arithmetic, right, and you kind of demobilize the masses, it then leaves the space empty, right, for the return of these sort of inherited aggregations, inherited sort of classifications, and around which politics is born or politics is structured, right? And so, in one sense, you can think about this sort of this retreat creates the ground, in some senses, for a different kind of political subjectivity, which then kind of will dominate post-colonial India. Right. And the second consequence, I would say, is the failure of the social transformation project in India itself. And I focus mostly on land reform in the book, because that's the primary, the most central sort of transformational project. Right. And again, the hope of the assembly was that, right, that the state would be the primary agent of transformation. The state is kind of this rational state, expert driven, stands a distance from society, and so through a plan intervenes in society and changes it. Right. And I said this assumption proved to be faulty. And the best version of this I got from this writing from P.C. Mahalanobis, who's a very famous sort of writer of the second 5-year plan. And he's writing afterwards, reflecting on what you think the plan doesn't work. And he says the issue is not that the experts were deficient, right? That the expertise was wrong. It was that the mistake was that we thought that they were sufficient. Right? And he actually says that, in India, we had great experts and great planners, and we got all these sort of foreign come and do studies. But what China had was committed cadres, which we never had. Right? So in other words, you're saying that for social transformation, you need social mobilization, right? Popular mobilization. Because the way to understand it is, in some ways, this state or this transformational project went to the field without some kind of an organized popular support behind its back. Right? They did produce a plan for transformation, but what they did not generate a counterpower, right? You're dealing with this entrenched social power, let's say, of landlords, but you did not produce a counterpower, right, which can take that on. Right. And so in that sense, social transformative project itself sort of comes short because it's sort of separation from the popular politics. So just to conclude, I will just make this critical point and at a level of abstraction to say that the way I want to argue is that the problem is that post-colonial institutions were not anti-colonial enough in that sense, right? They didn't draw enough from their own anti-colonial past, right? And in that sort of, kind of this leaving aside its anti-colonial political forms and mobilizations. It's not just that there was some kind of, my wish list didn't get fulfilled, but even their own terms of social transformation, right? Even their own terms of establishing a strong democratic basis. All of those terms kind of come short, right? Precisely because they give up on this element of popular mobilization, right? So in some senses, not being anti-colonial enough frustrates some of even the post-colonial aspirations. Thank you.
Indeed, that was 25 minutes. Yeah. Would you like to go there?
I can read from here. What do you
It's
prefer?
up to you. Well, it's normally much better if we stand. Our first commentator is Nazmul Sultan, assistant professor of political science at Yale, and he is a political theorist and has worked on empire and anti-colonial thought, democratic theory, and global intellectual history. And his first book was published 2 years ago by Harvard, Waiting for the People, the Idea of Democracy in Indian Anti-Colonial Thought. And the work has also appeared in leading journals of our profession, American Political Science Review, which is how I came to know his work, Political Theory, and Review of Politics. And before his current appointment at Yale, he was an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and also a fellow at Christ's College, Cambridge, University of Cambridge. And he got his PhD. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. That's one.
Thank you, Professor Barshni, for the invitation. Thank you, Sandipto, for writing the book, and to Natalia for arranging the trip. One striking aspect of the recent growth of in scholarship on Indian political thought, I think, has been the centrality of India's constituent assembly, especially the constituent assembly debates in kind of contemporary writings on Indian political thought. Partly because of the disciplinary tension between legal theory and political theory. Political theories tend to have a complicated relationship with constitutionalism. As the great 20th century American political theorist Sheldon Olin once put it, the Constitution represents a moment of passivity and closure, as opposed to the creativity of, let's say, for him, and one example of this was the Declaration of Independence. Indian Constituent Assembly debates, for better or worse, had a different fate. Though the text emerged from uneven deliberation among roughly 300 assembly members and is quite cacophonous, it has become, in a way, a stable marker for Indian founding itself. So much so that constitutional founding and political founding have become synonymous. So one of the great virtues of Sandipto's book is that it does not assume a homology, an identity between constitutional founding and political founding. If the animating concern of Indian founding is social transformation, and as Sandipto is aware, and as his book shows, that one couldn't entirely write this process of social transformation into the constitution. And it's because social transformation, of course, is a kind of socio-economic process, something much bigger than writing a constitution into being. So assuming this non-identity between, I think, constitution and social transformation, this move allows Sandipto to trace and analyze the tension at the heart of the Indian founding project. The book also shows admirable sensitivity to the history of political institutions in post-independence India. Sandipto gives the administrative place, a central place that I think in the story of founding and what also happens afterward. And I think it's a genuinely laudatory move, because I think there's a paucity of good scholarship on the kind of emergence of the administrative state in early post-colonial India. His discussion of parliamentarism, I also found it quite powerful. I think as is his study of the tension between the judiciary and the executive in early post-colonial India. So while there's much to say in praise of the book, I'm going to now shift to kind of making 4 critical points in the spirit of this Adda. And the first point I wish to make has to do with the conceptualization of popular sovereignty in the book. So I agree with Sandipto on the point of departure, that popular sovereignty is crucial to understanding the Indian anti-colonial movement. So this question has been slow to attract interest, I think, because of the widespread assumption, especially among South Asianists, that universal suffrage amounts to popular sovereignty. It settles the problem of popular sovereignty. But I think as Sandipto's book also shows, that universal suffrage is just one institutional form. Popular sovereignty as such itself is much broader. It is a language, a form of authorization, and the ground for legitimation. The other reason that popular sovereignty has been a footnote to the history of Indian anti-colonialism is the preponderance of a certain social ontology, a certain social history, I would say, which maintained that Indian political actors, or a largely elite, the Bhadralok, invested in reform from above, but not in invoking or mobilizing the people. And this brings me to the first point where I want to press on Sandipto. I think the book ultimately affirms the broader thirst of this kind of socio-historical interpretation of Indian anti-colonialism. To be sure, Sandipto does not just argue that Indian elites neglected or underestimated the masses. His argument is more specific, that the elites were afraid of the masses and their revolution. So what exactly is the people for Sandipto? In short, it is a mobilized people, the people out of doors. For all the language of apparitions and absences, the people for Sandipto, I think, has a certain positive shape. They might be fugitive to the elites, but not to history as such. So at some point he says, I quote him, till 1919, the concept of popular sovereignty or democratic self-rule was far-fetched for almost all sections of the Indian political leadership. After 1919, the people as a potential subject of sovereignty became thinkable. So this to me is a slightly questionable framing. As Sandipto would agree, popular sovereignty or the people is above all an abstraction. And as an abstraction, it did not need a self-consciously mobilized people to become a reality. The Indian liberals, about whom Sandipto discusses, or even their precursors, such as the mid-century Bengal Renaissance figures, they're all deeply taken by the problem of the people. Everything they learned about political modernity taught them to expect a people. Or for that matter, when they're engaging in politics within empire, when they're making a claim, they had to ask, what is the ground of this kind of claim making, which in different ways always led them to the point that it could, in modernity, it could only be the people. But the problem was that the people appeared to be not present in India. So this is where I think taking the reality of ideas seriously is important. The people is, of course, not just an abstraction, but an abstraction with a history. 19th century thinkers that understood that the people as a category, it required certain conditions, social conditions, such as a moderate level of education, some economic independence, common belonging, and so on. The people became, in a way, the marker of historical development or underdevelopment, right? And in many ways, also at the same time, became normatively the ultimate ground of political claim-making, political imagination. And thus, while 19th century Indian political thinkers witnessed innumerable riots, peasant insurrections, and even the mutiny, none quite satisfied the abstraction they were in search of. Anti-colonial politics, in that sense, was not just about the elite, the fear of the elites. The so-called elites are also stuck in a more fundamental problem of what constitutes peoplehood and how to develop a people out of amorphous masses. And because these questions formed the language of political imagination in colonial India, one could not just dismiss them as mere ideology. Events, of course, shape ideas, but not always in a straightforward way. The eruption of mass movement in India after 1919, of course, on the one hand, had this more immediate effect in Gandhi's kind of new techniques of mass discipline through self-discipline, and on the other hand, in the kind of like the flourishing of federalist visions of like village republics, right? So these are both kind of very different responses to the, you might say in Sandipto's language, with this to mass mobilization. Even with Nehru, who describes mass protest and peasant movements in such vivid detail in his autobiography, the effect of mass mobilization was not so much fear or anxiety, but rather a discovery of the urgency of what he called the problem of social freedom and the attendant vision of an accelerationist state. So the question thrown up by the history of the people concept in India, I think, requires more than centering of the mobilized people. It requires also an appreciation of popular sovereignty as a problem immanent to political thought. This is not to say the hierarchy of classes and the attendant kind of sentiments of fear and envy did not exist in India. It certainly did, and perhaps more in the Constituent Assembly than in the canon of Indian political thought, having to do with the particular way the Constituent Assembly was formed. So as a historical argument, I think there's a significant gap between the intellectual history of the people and the constitutive outside story of the mobilizational people. Let me just mention a couple of very quick basic questions to kind of show the other side of the argument. For example, why did the insurrectionary people seem beside the point to political thinkers in search of an Indian people? I mean, they have encountered insurrectionary people for quite some time, right? Before 1919 even. Why did the development of the people become the reason of existence for anti-colonial thought long before any mass movement put it forward? Or, for that matter, why did the administrative state that supposedly was kind of anxious of the people nonetheless understood itself entirely in terms of the people? Sandipto's book offers, I think, interesting insights into this question, but there is a tendency to return to the trope of elitism in the final instance. It strikes me that these questions are not readily appreciable in the framework of a mobilized people versus anti-colonial or post-colonial elite. Now, this brings me to the second point I want to make, and this is about the place of the elite in this story. So first, a word on the Indian history of the concept of the elite. Sandipto's book made me curious enough to look into the history of the word elite in Indian historiography. Right? So, it doesn't really appear in early social history of Indian kind of politics. For example, A.R. Desai's very influential 1948 text, Social Background of Indian Nationalism, doesn't really mention the word elite at all. Right? It saw rise in Indian history, and mostly talking about Indian historiography here. It paralleled, I think, the popularization of the word concept in U.S. modernization theory, and which, of course, kind of borrowed the term and from Italian elite theory and gave it a kind of new meaning. And the modernization theorist, of course, was primarily fascinated by the elite, repurposing the old word from Italian elite theory, right, to not just describe a sociologically dominant class, but an upper class that moves the course of history, those who act as the midwife of social transformation. The first Indian historians to grapple seriously with this idea of the elite were social historians from Bengal, mostly from Bengal, figures such as Borun De, Ashok Sen, and Shubit Sarkar. In their work, the elite had a very specific meaning. Groups that are economically unproductive in the sense they don't own capital, yet are culturally enlightened. And these historians were drawn to the enlightened ethos of the elites, but also deeply disheartened by their inability to recognize the primacy of productive kind of power. The question of what lies outside the elites was registered in this early scholarship, but it was not central. This, of course, would become central with the rise of subaltern studies. As Sandipto notes, one important strand of subaltern studies, or one argument that at least some of them made, was the discursive reading of colonialism and anti-colonialism. Subaltern studies scholars maintained in different ways that the elites were captives of a semiotic system in which they could only reverse the Orientalist diagnosis of Indian problems, but could not really rise beyond it. So this produced a paradoxical politics where they kept returning to the very premise that they were trying to deny, which is the premise of colonialism. At this point, although subaltern studies was completely opposed to the naturalization of modernization, the two echo a similar meaning of the term. The elite are not merely an economic or cultural category, but those tasked with a revolution, with social transformation, yet unable to accomplish it. Right? So what lends the term elite its credence, its meaning in Indian kind of political thought or Indian history is really this: a fundamental and asymmetric group operating in a society invested in overcoming colonialism and modernizing itself. And this word recurs throughout Sandipto's book, even though he's critical of the discursive focus of some of his predecessors, I think. He wants to say this is not just a problem of representation, but of people existing as a mobilizational entity whom the elites are nonetheless unable to see, unable to incorporate because of their distance from the masses, because of their very elitism. So let me press Sandipto a bit on this via Nehru. From the 1920s onward, Nehru took great pride in thinking in terms of what he occasionally called the mass line. His critique of the old Congress was precisely that they did not know how to think in terms of the masses. But as Sandipto reminds us, centering the masses did not mean incorporating or centralizing mass agency in the project of post-colonial founding or social transformation. For Nehru, development was a process of social transformation involving things like an increase in productive capacities and fundamental structural changes in society. Right? And this for him was something that required industrialization, required state-led intervention. Now, is this a problem of political thought, or is it a problem of Nehru's elitist horizon? What exactly is the word elite doing here? Is it a reversal of modernization theory's heroic elite, one who is doomed because they took leadership of a transformation that they could not really officiate over? Are we, in other words, imputing a necessity to their thought that ultimately reduces to social history, when perhaps we should instead interrogate the theoretical foundation of this vision directly, the promise, limits, and contradictions of the founding visions of the developmental state? Point number 3, the administrative state. Sandipto makes two broad contentions. The first one is that the Constitution was written, as he says, with the pen of administrators. And the administrators became the privileged agent of post-colonial development. There's a lot of interesting stuff. His reading of basically the making of the assembly is fascinating, but I will bracket it. I'll focus on the second point. So privilege it might be, but was the new administrative state any less doubt-ridden? The new republic's reliance on administration is not in dispute, nor is Nehru's failure, for example, to reform the civil services, despite his calls to do this in the kind of anti-colonial kind of period. But the two reports he commissioned, especially the Appleby report, bring to the fore, I think, in many ways, the kind of genuine uncertainty in 1950s India about the role of the administration. There were fundamental doubts about whether the administration should be specialized or generalist. And these questions remained unresolved because Nehru believed the administration's job was not bureaucratically regulative, but had to change with the changing need of social transformation. Like the good modernist that he was, Nehru maintained that the administration cannot really make anything happen. It can only supply the right impetus to different sectors of society. Nehru did not quite have an idea of state capacity, what now political scientists call state capacity. The administrative state's place was always dependent on the shifting requirements of social transformation. His deep investment in community development so soon after independence had largely to do with this recognition that the administrative state is not permanent, but something that kickstarts activities that society must then carry on by itself. Right? So Nehru devoted so much time and attention in the 50s to getting to figuring out how he can get the people involved with the developmental projects. So that he and other planners sought to write a constitution that would not stand in the way of social transformation, I think is entirely correct. But these profound first-order dilemmas, do they not get subsumed, I think, in the self-assured picture of an administration determined to be the author of social transformation against the claims of the mobilized masses? My fourth point concerns the place of ethnos in this story. It is a theme that recurs in key parts of the book. In the third chapter, Sandipto argues that the entanglement, I quote him here, the entanglement of communal violence was not inherent to the logic of mass democracies. It was the unrealized promise of creative self-governments that did. So I think this is a hard argument to establish, explaining communal violence in terms of the failure of the creativity of mass politics. In the conclusion, he argues that because democracy without demos failed, this is partly why at least the ethnos is flourishing. And in the current moment. Clifford Geertz, with whose work Sandipto concludes the book, surveyed the new states across Asia and Africa in the early 1960s and was struck by the incredible force of what he called primordial attachment, not so far from Sandipto's ethnos. Geertz was concerned that the incredible mobilization of the primordial was not letting the experiments in creating civil sentiments proceed to get kind of started. Sandipto makes an intriguing counterclaim that it is the failure of developmentalism that gave rise to ethnos. So there's a causal question, right? What causes what? Is it the failure of the demos that causes failure of development that causes ethnos, or the other way around? But the causal question aside, what exactly is the political stake of seeing communal violence as a result of the failure of, let's say, popular mobilization? I think I would like to hear a bit more from this on this point. Thank you.
Our next speaker, commentator is Rohit Day, Associate Professor of History at Yale. Rohit is a legal historian of modern South Asia. He's been here quite a bit, but his affection for us remains undiluted. And we hope it continues that way. Be that continue. His book, A People's Constitution, Law and Everyday Life in Indian Republic, published by Princeton, we discussed 8 years ago, in a book adda. And that book got him multiple honors. William Hurst Prize of Law and Society Association, Heyman Prize in the Humanities from Yale. And he was also a finalist for India's leading book prize, non-fiction book prize, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Prize, given out at the Bangalore Literary Festival every year. He has a second book very recently out with Onit Shani called Assembling a Constitution. And his focus perhaps will be on the masses and the people and their role in the making of India's constitution. So let's hear another view on the making of India's constitution. Rohit Day.
Thank you, Ashutosh, for having me back, and also Sandipto for writing such a wonderful book. I mean, I feel like I've lived with these ideas for a long time that we've been in conversation. And while reading the book and also hearing our introductions, I was initially introduced as a legal scholar and Sandipto as a political theorist. But I would consider myself a historian, and Sandipto would deny the fact that he's a lawyer. But I was really aware in reading and preparing my comments that we are effectively still haunted by the ghosts of our original disciplinary training, both in how we kind of view the Constitution but argue with it. So I want to begin with sort of three reflections on, I think, three of the strongest bits of the book, which are methodological interventions Sandipto makes. The first is to expand sources behind the standard political theory reading of the debates. This is a meaningful extension. It connects the debates not just with its immediate political context, but a variety of documents going back to the 19th century, but also ahead after independence. Secondly, the style, the argument. This is a book that makes an argument that's based on multiple sub-arguments that go on to make sort of powerful critical interventions. It is no surprise it speaks across disciplines and is recognized by them. And finally, I'm grateful that the book takes law seriously, not just as an expression of class interests or part of a superstructure of society, but something that has a degree of relative autonomy that constrains and shapes politics and is meaningful to the actors involved. Since we were talking about the people, I'll perhaps begin my comments by reading out an extract from A People's Age, which was the Communist Party of India newspaper. Ramesh Chandra, writing in July 1946, reflects on the newly elected Constituent Assembly, saying, "It consists of wishy-washy liberals who have never been known to take part in any struggle, who are constitutional wranglers and lawyers but lack the vision altogether of a free India. There are notorious communalists, men who have all their lives fought the Congress and become household names for licking the boots of the British for profiteering and exploitation, landlords, industrialists, provincial lawyers, and loyal Khan Bahadurs." What would this assembly, the selections show us that this assembly is nothing but a poisonous fruit of a British plan. In 1950, as the Constitution was promulgated, the Communist Party of India planned to launch a series of protests where they would cover themselves in metal chains, symbolizing that the Constitution was a shackle of colonial domination. However, in 2025, as the Indian Constitution marked its 75th year, there are few greater champions of the Indian Constitution than its parliamentary left, including the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. I bring up these references to the Communist Party not because of the cover of the book, which is bright red, but to indicate that despite certain resemblances, this book builds on, but also in significant ways moves away from the kind of changing party position on the Indian Constitution. In fact, and I think Nazmul's comments also brought it through, the book is haunted by the ghost of yet another lawyer in denial, the younger Jawaharlal Nehru. And you actually sort of see his voice emerging as the voice of critique at various points of time. There are sort of two striking narratives on the Indian Constitution, which I think this book does an excellent job of rebutting. The first is a kind of anxiety that the Indian Constitution is, as Radhika Kumaraswamy says, a kind of pale imitation of Anglo-American constitutionalism. It is a derivative constitution. And I think the book makes a very strong argument that what we see emerging in India is original, and it sort of meets the moments. This also helps it kind of rebut the argument that the Indian Constitution is nothing more than a colonial continuity of institutional arrangements. Indeed, an argument that Sandipto makes earlier in 2014 and I think has moved on from, but also kind of culturalist critique that this is a non-indigenous constitution. It's importation of ideas from outside. The book very clearly shows that this is a constitution that is responding in particular to the problem of transition from the colonial to the post-colonial, specifically designed to meet certain post-colonial conditions. And he does this, General Garavan Lawson makes a kind of sweeping statement, which is very celebratory of the transition. But I think Sandipto's work is much more attentive to the legal architecture that it creates, and in particular paying attention to institutions like the figure of the administrator or the particular design of parliament. I think perhaps one of the strongest chapters is the way in which he rereads the section on the Supreme Court in the 1950s. So the general narrative has always presented the Supreme Court as a conservative colonial institution almost that is sort of following a narrow formalistic reading of English law against a kind of radical redistributive parliament. But as Sandipto says, the act of legal decolonization was the Supreme Court choosing to draw on an English common law inheritance and also an American jurisprudence and act in ways they could never act in the colonial state. In fact, the Supreme Court and the legal establishments, decolonization was embracing a full range of its powers. This was not a colonial continuity, but a very distinctively post-colonial formation. I want to sort of briefly flag, I think perhaps because I want to present an argument against it, a kind of strong version of the argument through the book, right? So the emergence of the Indian Constitution amongst world constitutionals is significant and helps us understand change elsewhere. It's significant because it's an example of, when you have a kind of anti-colonial mass movement, it shows how you move away from the dialogic creativity of the movement to the monological discipline of the administrative apparatus to construct a new post-colonial order. In a way, the two sort of figures that stand behind this argument is partly the Pranab Bardhan, Hamza Alavi argument about the nature of the post-colonial state. The Indian post-colonial state does not have the kind of bourgeoisie that can create a hegemony. There are competing interests between the agrarian and the industrial elites. And in some ways, the professionalized, bureaucratic, middle class sort of salaried government servants, judges take over and negotiate between these two groups. In another version, Partha Chatterjee suggests that because of the kind of messiness and lack of control over electoral politics, there's an attempt to turn questions like economic questions out of the realm of popular politics and into the more technocratic administrative framework of planning. In this telling, while the book acknowledges that the bringing in of universal adult suffrage marks a significant shift in how a state seeks legitimacy, there is a sort of underlying concession that suffrage without land redistribution is not enough. The ballot was not enough against. The ballot is not a defense enough against an essentially undemocratic society. At a point, we compare the Indian democratic experience to the failure of Reconstruction and Du Bois reflecting on Reconstruction in Britain. And I think that perhaps the question I think I would like to sort of begin with, if the Indian project of universal suffrage so ineffective, why does the Indian state spend so much time in disenfranchising voters, particularly in the state of Bengal, to which Sandipto and I sort of both originally come from? So let me now turn to sort of the kind of big sort of figure in the book, the question of the absence of the people. And in this, Sandipto builds a narrative of the emergence of a people activated really from the non-cooperation movement. And these energies are not fully absorbed by the Congress, though the Congress remains the kind of chief claimant to it. We also see sort of energies emerging from the left, revolutionary terrorists, and sort of unionized labor. It is striking that caste and religious-based mobilization is left out of this narrative of the mobilization of people. In some ways, in the telling, 1942 marks the moment in which the people arrive on the scene. It's partly the Quit India movement, where the Congress leadership is arrested, and we really see an upsurge of younger leaders who are less concerned about the disciplined forms of nonviolence. It's also a moment of time when the ban on the Communist Party of India is lifted, because the CPI is collaborating with the colonial government, because the USSR and Britain are in part. This is also a moment where the communists have fairly uncontested political space to capture unions and engage in strikes. The book sort of talks about in the assembly, the people are seldom heard. They are heard distantly as a source of din, alarming if not fully legible. And there's a sense of the fear of the people. And it proposes a kind of alternative world where one could have turned the Constitution into a subject of popular engagement. On page 126, and I just read it out. If there was an election for a Constituent Assembly, it would have been a semi-revolutionary situation. As Nehru imagined, at stake would be the shape of post-colonial India. It could have compelled the Congress to partially translate the constitutional project from the language of administrators to the idiom of mass politics. It could have provided space for other dissident groups to find a space of voice, which includes communist, socialist, associations of marginalized castes, and neglected regions. It could have produced claims, counterclaims about representation, and challenged the supposed authors of the post-colonial regime to construct a constitutional language that would be widely shared and accepted. And I think this is perhaps a kind of methodological difference in our recent book, Ornit Shani, and I argue that this is precisely what happens in 1946 through 1950. And in some ways, the Constitution is not something that is separate or removed from politics, but is actually generative and central to a variety of political movements. But I want to sort of move away from the kind of the kind of debate over facts, but think a little bit about what it means to understand and imagine the people. So in this particular telling, the people are, in some ways, the people are abstract. They are not the real people outside the room. And there is an imagination that people can be mobilized around certain interests. So when we look at the mobilizations in the 1940s, the Tebhaga movement of the Telangana rebellion is marked, but not, say, the Krishak Praja Party or the Muslim League mobilization in Bengal, even though in some cases they overlap, or Periyar and the Justice Party sort of taking to the streets in Tamil Nadu, or the emergence of the DMK. And while the book is very careful to mark that popular energies are not always harnessed for progressive ends, there's little mention of the violent communal riots that are breaking out across the country. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we think about why the figure of the administrator, the administrative constitution, seems to take shape. There is a sense here that religion and caste are imagine unalterable ascriptive identities, really something, and this is really something that is formed through a kind of colonial politics of in Nehru's words, divide and rule, right? So, for example, the minority question, which emerges in this time, is described as an alibi for the persistence of some forms of imperial supervision. And this does seem to be, this is the line that is taken in some ways by the Congress. How do we then imagine the actual mobilization of minorities who are expressing a fear of being subsumed by another people, or the description of that the Muslim League takes of Muslims as another nation and not just a minority? In many cases, we see the mobilization of the same kind of actors that participate in the Tebhaga revolution, who are mobilizing around the idea of Pakistan, for example, as a peasant utopia, again, in Bengal, recasting a minority question into a national question. It's a line that the Communist Party of India also takes when they sort of draw from Lenin and say that the self-determination of nationalities requires sort of support to the Pakistan movement. And I don't think this is a kind of accidental sort of movement, because it also in some ways explains why there wasn't a popular election to a Constituent Assembly and why it might not have resolved these problems, because the question even before that election was the design of suffrage and a question of representation. So if we imagine a universal adult suffrage-led election with the kind of electoral system that was in place, I am not certain we'd see the kind of politics that Sandipto would want to have seen at that particular point of time. This also becomes quite stark when it comes to the question of caste, and I very much agree with. In many ways, the book describes, drawing on Bakshi, that the Indian state sort of on all post-colonial states, live in fear and trembling of its people, and therefore they have all of these extra legal powers. But the other description that Bakshi makes of the Indian constitution is that one that declares a normative war on the caste order. So it abolishes untouchability, brings in equality, regulates. One of the few places where it regulates private spaces, such as wells and temples, is around questions of caste. And in some ways, the process of affirmative action is actually a radical redistribution of economic resources. So the genealogy of rights that the book refers to talks to social economic rights and fundamental liberties, drawing from the Karachi Resolution, in which one can see the kind of energies of trade unions and left movements going in, but it does not make space for the kind of transformation of society around the aspect of caste, in which the Constitution plays a truly significant role. Finally, what I found actually that really compelling is the last epilogue, which puts the writing of the book in its particular moment. Indeed, Sandipto and I share similar biographies. We were studying law at a time when the Indian Constitution was being celebrated as this kind of global product or mark of a country ahead of its time, a part of a global family of constitutional systems, including the US, Canada, Europe, and South Africa. But there was also a moment that increasingly that this was under strain and did not reflect the actual conditions at that time. And as Sandipto describes, the book, in fact, began as a longer conversation to act as a check to this corrective liberal celebration. However, the process of writing books and dissertations are time-consuming, as we all know, but we are at a moment where I don't think there is any complacency about the liberalness of the Indian Constitution, but the puzzle remains that why is the Indian Constitution still such a source of hope and mobilization for a vast majority of its people? And perhaps the way to think out of this is to sort of not see political society and the kind of civil constitutional society as two distinct fields, but really groups that feed into each other. So while on the one hand, we do see the state and legal institutions being used to disempower groups of people, we also see a range of marginalized groups mobilizing around constitutional language and law, and perhaps not being limited to the definitions imposed upon them by the state and the courts. I want to sort of perhaps leave us with sort of three questions that are broader beyond the book, and I think reflect on the book's importance in speaking to larger questions of both comparative constitutional law and political theory. The first is a kind of comparative question, which was quite central to Sandipto's earlier work, and I would love to see him speak more about it, which is locating the Indian Constitution in a kind of larger genealogy of constitutions brought by popular movements to achieve similar ends. Most strikingly, the Mexican Constitution from the early 20th century. And one of the key differences between the Mexican and the Indian Constitution is the Mexican Constitution also focuses on a kind of radical decentralization by restoring the autonomy of pueblos and municipalities in a way that the Indian Constitution overtly centralizes. I'm also struck here by the Sri Lankan Constitution of 1972, which is authored actually by a Trotskyite, member of the Trotskyite Sri Lankan left, which limits judicial review, limits fundamental rights, emphasizes social transformation, in fact, actually does achieve significant social transformation, but is also transforms the constitution into an ethnic object and lays the roots of the civil war that would divide Sri Lanka. Secondly, I want to sort of turn to post-colonial legalism. And there is a sense here that legalism is often a kind of weapon of the powerful, of the conservative, to mobilize law, to take out contexts. But we are at a moment in time where increasingly we see that when a judiciary is no longer bound by formal procedures or by law, legalism becomes a way of keeping a judiciary and a state in check, and not just an instrument used by the state to sort of push back at the masses. How would one sort of reflect on the question of post-colonial legalism? And finally, I was hoping Sandipto would sort of speak a little more about the distinction between transformational and transformative constitution. And I bring this up because as we speak, there is a 9-judge bench of the Indian Supreme Court, which is where the Solicitor General says he does not understand what transformative constitution is, even though that's a term that's used to describe the Indian Constitution. And the court is trying to adjudicate whether there is something called constitutional morality, which is greater than just public morality or popular morality. My in following the kind of iterations, I really enjoyed this opportunity to be able to ask these questions, and none of it takes away from the fact that this is a book that will survive generations, and it's generated of multiple conversations. So, thank you.
उदय वहाँ हो गए? यहाँ से बोलोगे? Okay. Last commentator, Uday Singh Mehta, Distinguished Professor of Political Science, CUNY Graduate Center. He's been working on political theory for a very long time. I first met him when he started his career at MIT. I was a PhD student there. And at that point, the book that was being discussed was The Anxiety of Freedom, his first book. The second book, Liberalism and Empire, changed me so much that it changed my understanding of liberalism and it changed my understanding of empire. So this is how, in my view, how important Uday's work was to my understanding, my political science understanding of a theoretical concept, liberalism, and a historical phenomenon, empire. Uday will speak for 15 minutes, and I suppose...
No, I'll speak for much less.
Okay. All right. So Uday Mehta.
Thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be back in Brown. I was thinking if I've ever learned as much from a book as I learned from this. And the answer is no. It's not just because I'm not a historian, I don't have the erudition of these two other commentators. It's just I'm a political theorist, and so Sandipto, you've done an incredible job. I do have one big complaint against this book. It's a kind of complaint, but it's also a kind of expression of envy. I have never in my life read a book in which there are 135 pages of notes. And, you should never write these kind of books, okay? So let me say where I might be troubled by this book. I take that statement back. I wonder if you overstate the distinction between the colonial situation and what comes after. After all, the colonial situation had it was not a major transition from colonial to post-colonial. After all, as you point out, the personnel were the same, the structures were the same. So I'm not sure, I say this with due humility, I'm not sure that what motivates this is a real problem. I see more or less major continuities between what was happening in colonial times and what came later. But I agree with you on the transformations that come later. Where I don't agree with you entirely is, was the colonial constitution quite as, let me just use a word, reactionary as you make it out to be. Now, I agree with you that the one thing that empires cannot do is they cannot sanction popular sovereignty, because that is, as you rightly said, the denial of that is the thing on which imperialism rests. But I think more or less everything else they can do. So, I mean, if you look at the colonial situation, if you look at it, it's generally a story of, let's just call it, progress. Indians didn't have certain rights earlier; they come to have rights. And I think that's the point of the Nehru Report of 1928. Motilal Nehru is saying, he's acknowledging where they've come through these colonial mechanisms. And I'm not sure they couldn't have done more other than on this issue of popular sovereignty. So I imagine
Universal franchise are there?
Yeah, I think so.
They would have.
They could have.
Okay. I'll have something to say. It's a big point in his book.
Yeah. What?
Universal franchise is a fundamental departure from the colonial times.
Yes, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah.
But I don't think if the British had been around for another 100 years, God forbid,
They would not have.
They couldn't have introduced that. So there I would press Sandipto. What is the difference between popular sovereignty and universal franchise?
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted.
No.
But
You should interrupt her. So now I concede that there is a kind of social agenda post-constitutional, post the Indian Constitution. I see that agenda, for instance, in the directive principles. But that too, after all, much of it could have happened in the colonial constitution, to the extent that they had a constitution. So that's the gist of my comments. Now, I could go into details, but my major concern is, are you trying to solve a problem that actually doesn't exist? But as I said, I learned a heck of a lot from this book. I mean, they may have something to do with the fact that I'm not a historian and these guys know a lot more about, this than I do. So thank you for writing it.
Let me take 5 minutes on my comment.
Can I just raise a two-finger follow-up and perhaps batting Sandipto this time? I mean, I do think, so the British do not believe in Bill of Rights for the colonies, and they do not give it to any of the colonies that they set apart, even in the
So they don't give it to
50s.
America.
They don't give it to America, but that's in the 18th century. They don't give it to like Ceylon and Malaysia and all of these other places, even in the 50s. So there's a strong belief that this is not something you need. Whereas the Karachi Declaration makes it quite clear that there will be, the purpose of the movement is to lead to rights. So there is I mean, I would think there is an anti-colonial constitutional vision which is different from what colonial constitutionalism could have presented. The only right in the colonial constitution is property, and to a limited extent, freedom of religion.
A few points to consider as you, and I'm coming to you now as a comparative politics person who now consumes a lot of political theory but cannot ever claim, even for the rest of my professional career, that I'm a political theory. But I do consume a lot of political theory now. That was not true earlier. First point. Elite politics and mass politics is quite central to your argument after 47 in particular. Can be conceptualized as a binary, but doesn't have to be. Consider a very important concept, comparative politics concept about a kind of democracy which is called consociational democracy, as opposed to liberal democracy. Is that relevant? That whole debate that R.N. Leibhardt, great Dutch political scientist, became part of our life in America, raised based on four smaller European democracies after 1919. So, and the only person, I've written a little bit about this, but the person who's given a full-length treatment to this problem is Stephen Wilkinson, who calls, and I wrote about it too, but never with such detail, Jinnah's proposals as consociational proposals. Because the idea that Muslims as a community would have to be given a certain share of power in the executive, in the legislature, and in the judiciary, and in the police. And in his case, of course, initially the argument was not just 25%. 25% of India was Muslim at that time, but much more than that. And groups would be the unit of democratic politics, not individuals. Right? That is central to consociational democracy. Right? And Stephen very rightly is arguing there is no way Indian National Congress could have accepted that. Right? And in fact, the nature of politics that developed had to even give up on the idea of separate electorates, which is also central to consociational democracy. Right? So if you introduce the idea of consociational democracy, then the real elite-led democracy in comparative politics is consociational democracy, where the masses play a very small role, right? And they're organized as pillars, ethnic pillars, religious pillars, racial pillars, right? And their leader, as in the famous title, spokesman for...
Sole spokesman.
The sole spokesman is a consociational idea in our democratic theory. The sole spokesman is a consociational idea. Okay, so then you have an elite-led politics, which I'm describing to you, elite-led democracy, which I'm describing to you as a consociational democracy, and a liberal democracy that India went for, with some limitations, as much more mass-based. Right? And therefore, a trichotomy, what does it do to the argument that you would like to make? Second, partly in agreement with Uday, actually the British colonial masters did give universal franchise to Ceylon in 1931 through Donner More Commission.
The Ceylonese leaders didn't want it. The
Ceylonese leaders. That is also true. The Ceylonese leaders, especially the minorities, did not want it. But actually, even the Sinhalese leaders, not only Tamil leaders, even Sinhalese leaders didn't want universal franchise, and it was imposed on them. And there is a wonderful paper being written as we speak on why would something like that happen. Why would Ceylon or Sri Lanka was the first universal franchise in the global South even before independence. Colonialism, they were happy with that. But that paper is going to actually being written by Slater, will educate us a lot about the calculations there of the colonial power. Right? And the argument also is that it would not have been done in India, incidentally, in that paper. That Ceylon produced something very. So this is the argument about. So I think locating India's constitution comparatively is, in my view, is a very good idea. The point that Rohit is making. He's using Mexico much more than Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is next door, and why are they conceding universal franchise? Right?
Smaller. They are much smaller.
Maybe, yeah, maybe, and they have a serious also minority issue. Right, they're conceding that, and finally, maybe okay, two more points. One, your notion that mass politics or mass mobilization would transform your communal or caste self into a political self, which is presumably more capacious than your ethnic attachment. A lot of empirical literature says mass politics inevitably, or more often than not, if not inevitably, turns into ethnic politics. Right? So in a way, this was, remember the great communist argument, Marxist argument was that the Soviet Union would be a post-nationalist nation polity. And as it started collapsing, and Yugoslavia similarly, right? As it reached towards its end, it broke out into ethnic warfare of a serious sort. So Soviet Union less so, Yugoslavia, of course, more so, right? And then if you go through Donald Horowitz and others, right? There's a serious issue there. The mass politics, right, does not necessarily transform the political self. It might recuperate. It might draw out the ascriptive identities, and in a fairly violent way, right? And finally, I think a bit of Huntington maybe, or Hobbes may be necessary here. Hobbes through political theory, Huntington through comparative political science. The claim, and this is becoming more and more important now, the claim is that without political order, which you decry in many ways here, right? You say mass mobilization should have continued, and India imposed order, right? India imposed order first through the constitution, and then again and again governments did that, right? Incidentally, when Periyar led a South Indian moment might be necessary in this book at some point, or its further development. When Periyar led caste-based movement and his fights with Gandhi, he called it a real mass movement of lower castes against Brahmins. And why is Gandhi not conceding that? Why is Gandhi saying the fight is only against the British? Fight, and Gandhi's argument is, I read it this way. Can I document this with two, three statements? I don't know. I will try as I proceed further in this work. Gandhi was basically saying we can't open two fronts in politics. If we open the caste front in politics, as opposed to the fight against the British, which in turn involves a Hindu-Muslim issue, right? Then it will not be able to fight against the British. The two-front problem, right? Now, I say this with an understanding of how ethnic politics works, etc. But can I produce a document for you for saying I can't. He said the only issue about caste that I'm worried about is untouchability, and I will fight against it. But changing the caste order or OBC versus Brahmin problem, no, I'm not getting involved in that, right? And Periyar was saying that's mass politics. Okay. So now, returning to Huntington, Hobbes, in a way, Hobbes wrote long ago, and there was a civil war, and there had to be, and so let's put civil war aside for a moment, which is an extreme disorder. But basically, Huntington going through all the evidence, there are 35 countries in that book, Political Order in Changing Society, 35. And he says it is very clear that without establishment of political order, you can neither run development nor democracy. right? It's a prerequisite. So he again and again says, and he continues right till the end, or he continues to say, there has to be temporal priority of order over democracy in order for democracy to work. Right? So I leave it. Or you can see where this is going, right? So the idea of governance and controlling mass mobilization can be read this way as well. That order is a prerequisite. Political order is a prerequisite of both development and democracy. But thank you for provoking all this. And all, I think people hinted at this. This is so beautifully written. The felicity of prose, right? The elegance of writing here is just unbelievable. Yeah. So thank you for making the evening, the 3 evenings when I read this so beautiful. Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Very well. And then we'll open up. Like if you want to collect questions first. You want to answer?
Maybe given the time, because otherwise there's like
okay.
Yeah. So
collect
and then maybe I try to answer some of them.
Then
but,
okay,
yeah.
we'll leave the last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Questions. So let's open up. Tirana, and then we go to Prerna. Yeah.
Yeah, because part of constitutional point, I was wondering if there are weird overlaps in scholarship on Chinese constitutionalism. Yeah, obviously it doesn't make sense. Intuitive comparison, right? Because it doesn't seem that we need to study Chinese. I was thinking about, I think it's Neil Diamond's recent book, Useful Bullshit, on how
What?
it's called Useful Bullshit.
Useful
on,
bullshit.
like the production of multiple Chinese constitutions, the effort to solicit opinions from the people both during the Maoist era and the post-Maoist era. And so I was wondering, obviously, a lot of suggestions have been made, comparisons, Ceylon or Sri Lanka, Mexico, but I wondered if any world in which Soviet constitutionalism or constitutionalism in the PRC interesting. Second half. The other question, I think, is on the point about elections and how we define an empire. Britain itself, domestically, doesn't really even have a universal male franchise till 1918. But just hearing the conversation, I was curious about how you of empire, what the nature of imperialism or colonialism is, or one is trying to escape the colony. Because in various archival and other materials that you studied, if there's some sense of debate or contestation over how you define colonialism, right?
Prerna?
Yeah, this was great. I mean, the book and then also just read of a panel. So it's really been fantastic. I didn't really have a question so much as a reflection, and interestingly, it builds on Tirana's insofar as some of you know that I've been working a while on a book in India in the 1950s. And so I was really struck by Nazmul, your point about the fact that Nehru himself was speaking, even if incipiently, about the idea of mass line. And to return to Sandipto, your point really about what is the place of the people, which again, all of you have dealt with in your work in different ways. And so I just, so it was interesting for me to hear you mention that Nehru had actually used this language, which is unfamiliar to me. And also, and you mentioned the community development project, an archive that I've delved into. And so there is this real tension, which you're highlighting on the one hand, between the spear, the din of the people, on the other hand, this commitment in the post-colonial period to what is, at least in theory, a kind of radically participative project. And perhaps then also using some of this language, which of course belongs to the Chinese Revolution and in particular to Mao, for whom it was much more than rhetoric. It really was the way that and that's why when I think about the kind of developmentalist state in the kind of Escobar terms, it does linger, but the way in which you think of the route to, even within the umbrella of the developmentalist state, there are these kind of different routes. And so when I think of, okay, so even if we kind of buy that, or at least, I hate that language, but I use it, even if we kind of, subscribe to this belief that there was some place for the people in the post-colonial developmentalist state, it was quite different from, of course, what it was for the Chinese. But then I keep thinking, okay, so if Nehru had this kind of tentative relationship to the agency of the people, what was it that he was fully behind? Like what was not unequivocal for him? And the kind of, for me, I always think about it as people versus science and secularism. And so in my book, I call it like scientific secular modernity, because the way in which the people are feared science is not. And it is that relationship, almost kind of dichotomy between science and the people. And of course, this is a book about the Constitution, and so I don't expect it to kind of figure there. But when you're talking about communalism and, Ashu also brought up ethnic politics, I keep wondering, secularism to me is in some weird way kind of wedded to science, also in that. And so I'm just kind of wondering, when you're thinking about the place of the people or the lack thereof within the Constitution, I'm wondering if you can also think, about not just, and of course Gandhi again, who is neither in favor of science nor secularism, is so, so when I think about it, I think of Nehru, and then beyond, and then you think of Gandhi, and then beyond that, I think of Mao, and then you think of the communists who kind of, Rohit referred to. And so I began by saying that, quite uncharacteristically, I don't have a question, because insofar as it really has been a wonderful evening, but I'm just wondering if you can kind of reflect a little bit on what does it mean for Nehru and the constitution makers to have this relationship with the people within this one particular moment of the constitution making, but within that kind of broader agenda of development, as it's already being foreshadowed, but really takes fruition in the 50s and the 60s.
Patrick.
So yeah, thank you everyone. This is really extraordinary. And Sandipto, this was the last week of classes at Brown, and I actually read the things that I assign to my students, and didn't have time, but your book's on my list to read next week. And I wanna hear from you more about the counterfactual that you set up. I mean, what would have a more inclusive, mobilizational constitution have looked like? So yeah, there's the right to vote. We know that's a pretty blunt instrument of accountability. We know elites and parties. This is the whole passive revolution line. In Gramscian theory.
Which he uses, incidentally.
Yeah, no,
It's
I'm
mentioned.
sure. Everyone who talks about the Indian transition talks about a passive revolution, but they never talk about the mechanisms, right? And that's why I really want to read your book, because there are the mechanisms, right? Because the law, the constitutional, shapes the associational field. And here, the only real point of accountability is the universal franchise, which is a radical departure from the past, for sure. But in a huge country, and to Rohit's point, with really no provisions for decentralization, right? This is the most centralized democracy in the world. And what I call the institutional surface area of the Indian state is about as narrow as it gets. And there's not a lot of places where the citizen can go besides the polling booth to actually claim their rights. You could talk about the courts, I'd love to hear thinking more about what that would have looked like, to actually create spaces for mobilization. And then on this whole sort of Huntington question, there's an internal counterfactual, which is Kerala. There was a mass line, there was mass mobilization. They did build points of interface through quasi-corporatism and strengthening the unions and building out public spaces, etc. It did not produce communalism. In fact, it produced the most inclusive developmental state in the nation, and there might be some parallels with Tamil Nadu and the Dravidian movement, which suggests that mobilization of the subaltern before the lock-in of the political order is actually good for democratization, right? And the other obvious point of comparison is Latin America. The decolonization in Latin America was the ultimate passive revolution. The people were never empowered, and you got the worst inequality anywhere in the world, at least in Gini terms, et cetera, with the dominance of European descendants at the expense of every other segment of the Latin American population. And there, the comparison is the Brazilian 88 constitution, because all the other Brazilian constitutions disenfranchised everyone except 5% of the population. In 88, it's universal franchise and municipalization. They recognize cities as a third tier of constitutionally protected governance. And all of Brazilian politics since then have been about mass mobilization at the city level, which has made Brazil, I think, in terms of building out a welfare state and being inclusive and actually enforcing rights, the great success story of the last 50 years, with obvious parallels to Kerala. And I mention this simply having not read the book and dying to read it now, these are the counterfactuals, right? That some of the elements of the Brazilian at different times, different circumstances, I get that, but similar fears by elites that if you mobilize the people. In Brazil, the fear was not communalism, the fear was always communism, which is what justified coup after coup after coup after coup. And even now when Bolsonaro comes back to power, it's literally by saying, we've empowered the communists and they're threatening the political order.
Yes, you'll have your. The biggest opponent of the third tier of democracy in India was who? Ambedkar. Gandhi wanted Ambedkar's opposition is very clear. That third tier would make the upper caste doubly powerful. They are socially powerful and they will also be elected.
Can I do finger that? You're absolutely right.
See, Ambedkar, Madhav Khosla gets this right. That it actually, he wants the center of power to be away from the village. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
I agree. You're absolutely right. But I know this actually, Nazmul kind of has in his PPSR piece about village republic, right? Do you mention Nazmul? And so basically Gandhi kind of wants to go to village republic.
Yes, he does.
And Nehru actually doesn't.
Yeah.
So Nehru also kind of goes.
Nehru is with Ambedkar on this, yes.
Not quite, but there's a different thing. You often think of the word Gawar. So in the CDP reports in the archives, they actually talk about it. That what is the word Gawar? Used as a slur, it's quite pejorative, but essentially it's a descriptive term to refer to someone from a village. And so actually, Patrick's point kind of reminded me of the question, which is that, so, I think that, is there anything in the Constituent Assembly about, like, when the people are talked about, is there any kind of nuance on who the people are in terms of this? Because I think the one thing that at least my reading of the post-colonial developmental state brings out is that the people who are truly feared are the people in the village. They are the ones who are the kind of both the subject of the uplift and the kind of neo-civilization, but also are truly feared in many ways. And that gets to Patrick's point about therefore not wanting to go to the village republics or that last stage. I think the conversation about municipalities, because of the kind of low level of urbanization, never quite arrived. And so I guess, I had a question about kind of disaggregating the people and wondering whether the village or the countryside or the hinterland kind of is there as the kind of term of reference.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. It's 15 minutes left. Yeah, lovely.
First of all, thank you, all of you. This is, this is really a treat. I mean, there are things you've brought up which I haven't even think about myself. So this is really the most sort of gratifying thing as a writer. I want to say with Uday, Nazmul, and Rohit, I want to acknowledge this because I won't be able to answer all your questions. There are 11, I counted 11 questions, all three of you altogether put there. But I want to just please say this, that I think all the critical comments are both fair, absolutely fair, and they're all very, very serious. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that, these are the best kind of critiques one can have. And if I had the time, I would love to engage with all of them, but I will try to kind of, club them together to the extent I can possibly can. Because maybe start with the question, I think, which is a variant of this that most asked from Patrick to Ashu to all three of you, the question about what would a more mobilized or more intensified mass movement look like? Would that, create more communal tension? Nazmul asked the question, what's that political stake for saying it would? I would not have, right? So I think there's an easy answer, which I think Patrick gave better than I already could have. I think there's the Kerala, especially with the land reform, Kerala, Bengal, I think proves many of the points I'm making, but I'm not the one to say that. People like Ronald Herring, Atul Kohli have been sort of making this point. But what's distinct about them is this ability of a more mobilized party cadre and what that, it's not but that's an easy empirical answer, but I think it's more of an analytical debate, which so therefore let me try to kind of get to that, right? So of course, you cannot ever say what would the counterfactual happen, right? Most likely, yes. I think Indian mass politics was deeply communalized. I mean, some would argue that partition violence was a form of mass politics. It was kind of, uncontrolled. It was, decentralized, and so there's no point in sort of trying to deify mass politics, clean, nice thing, which have given us progressive results. And I say that in the book in a couple of times. So I don't want to say that's the case. However, this is the point I think I want to make is more theoretically, which is that, so Mahmood Mamdani has a really great, and of course he is very influential in some of these exact arguments, which is to say that he says there are social facts and there are political facts, right? And one of the claim of colonial rule was that social facts map onto political facts. There is no distinction, right? And his point was that one of the major attempts of any anti-colonial movement, either actually or aspirationally, has to be to create a distinct set of political facts which are not just the social facts reflected, right? And that mediation is the real kind of political battle. How do you make that translation and what form the translation takes, right? Because if you don't think that's possible, but let's just take what's the other thing here, right? I don't think it's possible. Then what we are in a situation where India is, irrevocably a country of distinct groups, however you want to sort of, slice that. Of course, not to say that this is a British, invention. Of course, caste, religion, very real things have been in politics in more real ways. But if we take those as immutable facts, politically speaking, right, then all you're left with is a situation where this can never be overcome, right? And then there's two kind of solutions come to that. One is the kind of the Jinnah model, which is to say that this is the fact of Indian life. Best we can think of is try to kind of negotiate and manage at the constitutional level, right? That's the best hope we have, right? And that's kind of a version of the minority question. Sometimes, I think when I said that in the colonial alibi, it's actually not mine, it's Faisal's term. I know, it's a very Faisal Devji kind of argument. But the point there is that often the colonial rule was often extended. This was given argument given that if we leave, they will just kill each other, right? So then all you can have a constitutional settlement of a political question, right? That's all you can expect for. Or you can think that there is a pathway, some form, right, in whatever halting fashion, of making that transition possible. Right. Now, this is not, I think, I want to say, that's what I say, it is not necessarily an empirical claim. I'm not saying it would have happened or it's easy to happen. It most likely would have not happened, actually, for multiple different reasons. But I'm saying that at least the political horizon, and I think, to my mind, the anti-colonial movement's promise, right, was in that direction it could have happened. And I think the sort of very sort of fragile historical basis of that are the kind of the histories, and there are various kind of localized histories of the Quit India movement. Some which I quote, and one consistent theme, and maybe they are ideologically motivated potentially because they're Congress figures or Communist Party figures. The idea that the including, for example, the INA rebellion brought together Hindus and Muslims, the only kind of moment where this kind of crossed at this moment of intensified mass mobilization. Right. Now, again, I keep saying this is not a causal political science kind of argument. I'm just saying more as an aspirational thing, right? If we don't buy that, then all we are left with is a notion of, and sadly that notion is not saying it's a colonial invention, but that was the colonial view of Indian society, right? And that was also the Cambridge School historiography view of that there's no India, there can't ever be Indian people, all we can have a population managed together, right, in some form. So I think that's the kind of political stakes of making their arguments. It's not necessarily in this, there is a, you can be a causal sort of factual kind of claim with Kerala, but that has own limitation. But I want to make it more as a it's a theoretical claim. So that's one sort of big point I think many of you brought up. As the other point, I would say this with both, I think in Nazmul and Rohit differentially, I think there's a very important methodological point. I think Nazmul is asking, I think it's a very serious question. I think in a way I would say, what should post-colonial political theory look like in some ways? I think Nazmul making an argument, it has to take this genealogy of ideas seriously. And I think there's an argument to make that often in the colonial post-colonial context, these ideas are kind of given the second sort of, backstage to the political development element of it, right? And so that's, I think, a very, very important serious methodological point. And I think it's a very fair and well taken point that when talking about things like, elite, people, popular sovereignty, administration, ethnos, all these things I don't necessarily do or very tendent to a longer genealogy of ideas within the Indian sort of discursive sphere, right? So again, I would say two things. One, I think what I try to do in the book is not about what did Indians mean about popular sovereignty. By the way, that is Nazmul's book, and it's a brilliant book, which you should read. This book is more about trying to understand the contradictions of the constitutional moment or the transitional moment, right? So in that sense, it's engaged as a different work. That doesn't negate the importance of taking the ideational things more seriously than I do. I think that's very well taken point. But I think I was more interested in how, like, the kind of the dynamics or contradictions of the socio-political sort of developments kind of get reflected in and reflected back into these different conceptual forms which are arising at that time, right? So that's the first. I think Rohit has a similar, I think, very important methodological point, which I think I want to sort of take seriously because it's a very important political point, right? Which is to say that there is a much more simpler, I think, binary that I create between the institutional and the popular, right? And even if I sort of, distance myself from those who really want to make that argument very strongly, so I say someone like the subaltern side would basically say that it's a mutually almost autonomous sphere, right? The subaltern, and I want to say that, but nevertheless, there's a kind of binary, and that makes it difficult to understand kind of the examples you're giving, which is that why do constitutions become such an important vehicle of popular protest in India? It has been the last, say, 15, 20 since this government has come to power, right?
2024 election.
Yeah,
The campaign, he has the constitution in his hand.
Right.
All over the country, he went. Yeah.
And also the importance of the judiciary in these things, a question of process. So maybe my kind of semi-provocative answer to that, because there's a longer debate to be had about this, but the semi-provocative answer is that the way I will sort of suggest, and this also goes to the transformative constitutionalism argument, and I sort of mentioned very briefly in the introduction, which is that this idea of constitution as a law or constitution as a vehicle are both getting progressive priorities, right? I mean, the last 20, 30 years, I think there's not a single social movement in India which hasn't filed a case, right? So it is seen as a vehicle. It's the most sort of accessible medium for people in some ways, social movements, to get their demands met, right? As well as kind of to hope to protect democracy in forms. But I would say that is a result of a defeat, a very consequential defeat of this much more expansive idea of what constitutions could have done, right? And in that idea, law or lawyers play a secondary role. It's precisely when that gets defeated, and I kind of, you can map it very different ways. This is a periodization question, is a dicey one, as historians would say. I would perhaps do it with Indira Gandhi's sort of, because I think she sort of declares this idea of constitutional transformation dead by saying that, the judges are against transformation, I am for the transformation, we vote for one or the other, right? And this is a fraught history till then, but I think it's only at that, and you can say, look at a global story of the larger kind of eclipse of decolonization as this kind of much more expansive world-making kind of idea from the mid-70s onwards. And then you get this sort of much more narrower idea, I think, where judges and courts play a much more central role. Democracy is understood as protecting electoral integrity, protecting fair elections. That becomes the horizon of democracy, that's the horizon of transformation. But I think that is already, I think, kind of, the day after the defeat of this much more expansive idea of both what transformation could be and what democracy could be, right? So that would be my kind of, again, this I know it's a provocative answer, but I think that's because I think that's kind of brings together.
Can I ask it to
answer? Of course.
So this is not so much kind of search for an alternative constitution, but for alternative people.
You mean, sorry, I didn't understand.
Like, it is an imagination where the people are the ones who are transformed. They're not.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
yeah, okay.
absolutely. So yeah. So this other, happy picture, whatever I'm painting, it's not happy actually. Most likely wouldn't have been happy. But the idea is, which I kind of point to sort of make in my talk slightly, which is to say, and this sort of goes to the communalism question as well, the notion that if you participate or like some kind of true self-determination, doesn't just change the world around you, which is politics does. A collective action can change the world around you. It also changes who you are. So it's transformative in two different senses. It changes, what's around you, but in doing that, you change who you are as a subject acting in the world, right? And I think, therefore, it would have been, I think, at least the claim is that some kind of a more mobilized or enhanced popular participation in whatever form would lead to kind of a transformation of the self, right? Now, again, the terms of the transformation could go in different directions. Some could say the Ram Janmabhoomi movement is a popular movement which transformed, a caste idea into a Hindu idea in a very successful way, right? So that can happen in different directions. It's not given. It's, of course, that's what politics is. That's the battle there, right? But I do believe that it would be, yes, so there would be a different idea of what citizenship is. And I think that's to go to Patrick's point. There is I think sealing in of this, and I think happens quite soon. I think where, very early on, the local landlords are able to transform their social power into political power by elections, actually, because they are the ones with the most resources to win elections, and suddenly those who are just socially powerful become also the MPs and MLAs and of the local level, right? So actually, it goes the other way, rather than
That's what Ambedkar
state
is afraid
transforming
of.
society.
That is that's exactly what Ambedkar.
But the problem with the Ambedkar solution, I don't blame Ambedkar for that, because Ambedkar is someone who doesn't have the access to either the state or a party. He doesn't have it. So he's kind of figure, a lonely figure. I think his hope is on creative drafting of laws. Like that's the best he can, because he doesn't have control any other levers of power, right? So it's not really a fault of his, but the issue is if you, that I think over assumes an autonomy of the state from society. It over assumes that the state can stand in a distance and do these things. Well, what actually happens is actually the society takes over the state soon enough, right? And so that's the, another kind of, I'm sorry, I'm not answering all the questions. I'm trying to sort of get overarching themes. Other question, Nehru came up, I think, several times in different comments, in terms of how do I place Nehru? I think there's a way of thinking of Nehru as the tragic figure who can't, I think that's an older, S. Gopal, I think, began that idea of Nehru as a figure who doesn't have the ability to fulfill his own aspirations in some senses. So he has this, but he doesn't realize that what he has to do to fulfill it, right? As a mass leader, the second most popular leader after Gandhi, right? And that's an easy one to say Nehru, that's the sort of the tragic flaw of him. He doesn't understand the kind of, he thinks if he can retreat back, he loses control of Congress not in an institutional way, but in an effective way, right? Congress becomes a landlord, sort of center-right Hindu upper caste party, despite Nehru's best, attempt. And he kind of retreats back into Sirta Kaviraj, right? Retreats back into government and hopes the state can solve it for him, right? But he sort of, in that sense, in his after coming to power, he believes that it really is. So his sort of main figures become people like Maharanobesh, Omi Baba, who are his hope, not local Congress leaders, right? So I think Nehru, in that sense, the way I would sort of position Nehru is someone who kind of, to me, sort of personifies this misunderstanding of the progressive wing of this. There are people who are not even interested in transformation seriously. Right? There are many congressmen, the idea is not transformation, they want to preserve. These are people who sort of tank the Hindu code bill, for example. They don't want transformation. But those who do want transformation, Nehru being sort of the foremost figure in them, they misunderstand what you need. And this is where the Du Bois point comes in, where Du Bois makes his argument against the northern liberals, people who actually do want to transform the South, but they don't realize what that requires, right? And what that requires that requires generating, mobilizing, and keeping afloat a source of counterpower, right? Rather than just giving a good lever to the state. We have now ended the kind of forms of domination. Now we can get over, right? So I think Nehru therefore personifies the kind of that idea. In that sense, is the sort of the central contradiction of transformational constitutionalism, right? Which is to believe that you can actually do that without a disruption, without some disturbances, or without popular participation. Therefore. Right?
Can I create a slight problem?
Yeah, of course.
I know that we have 5 more minutes.
But that also goes to your Huntington question, by the way.
You're going to answer.
No, I'm just saying this sort of goes to that answer, whether order can actually get you development.
So I think you may have to problematize Nehru a bit more. Nehru is the person who's telling Chakravarti Rajagopalachari in Madras, then Madras, today's Tamil Nadu, that, my dear friend, we have been colleagues I'm just generating that conversation that is taking place there in all probability. My dear friend, we have been comrades and colleagues for how many years now? 25 years or so, 30 years or so. You are a Brahmin. You cannot lead Congress party in Tamil Nadu anymore. It has to be handed over to Kamaraj. Right. So every time once we bring the southern moment into this discourse about either Nehru or transformational politics or mass mobilization, etc., you begin to get a picture which requires notice of Calcutta and Delhi intellectuals.
No,
so he's actually telling Kamraj, Rajagopalachari is right. So it's over. The ball game is over for Rajagopalachari by 1953. 1953, Kamraj takes over the Congress party. And Nehru is the instrument there. Yeah. Right? So yeah, I think Nehru's fight with 2 Brahmin leaders of UP, Govind Vallabh Pant and Sampurnanand, I have now gone through a lot of it.
Right.
This is very serious.
Yes.
he actually gets rid of Sampurnananda, which one was it? Govinda, no, not Govinda Vallabhan. In 1951, the
Tandon.
Congress,
Tandon.
he gets rid of third was Purushottam Das Tandon. He
Who's
gets
a very
rid of
active
him
figure.
as the Congress, just as Gandhi got rid of Subhash Chandra Bose,
Right.
because Gandhi would not agree to violence becoming central to freedom movement.
Right.
Nehru would not agree to a Hindu nationalist leading the Congress party.
No, I don't disagree with that at all.
Right. So he gets rid of basically.
No, but the
Yeah.
problem, I think that's why Nehru.
So it's not a Brahman Baniya party for him, right? It's not.
Well, that's, but I think,
That's a Hindu nationalist
but I
party.
think-
He's not. He's fighting them.
but I think that's the mistake. So I just put it this way. I think the options are not Nehru versus, revolution. The options are revolution versus reaction. Nehru is interesting to me, and this transformation concept is interesting to me because it's not a reactionary. That's why I say it very clearly. This is not a Thermidorian project. The constitution is not about like shutting down mass movement. The whole is about this dialectic, right? That you need the mass movement. You are a democratic party, you're a communal democracy, but then you're trying to figure out the implications of this kind of democracy, right? And so it is this push and pull, which is why it's an interesting project. It's not a project about elite capture in that sense, right? It is a project, and Nehru is in that kind of figure who is. It's a sympathetic figure because he does actually commit to that. But I'm saying the problem is he doesn't fully commit to what I would argue the more radical methods of getting there. And if he thinks that Congress is not a Brahmin Baniya party, that's the kind of mistake. Because Congress, by the time, local Congress, and this is the kind of if you take someone like Jan Pandey, by 1930s already, Congress is the local levels captured by these major, local notables. And someone like Kamraj would be like the landowning castes in Tamil Nadu. The Nadars are very powerful castes, right? In Tamil Nadu. Not Brahmin, but the Nadars.
Tory tappers. Just above the untouchables, except just above untouchables.
No, but
They have property.
But they have land holding, right? A bit like Reddies and Rao in that sense.
No, they are like Udavas in
Okay.
Kerala. They're not. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah,
but-
Nadars become a major business community later.
Right.
That they do
Right.
much later.
Right.
Much later. Right. So Nadars are not even acceptable to DMK.
Right. No,
Okay.
right.
So this is but this is what he does anyway.
So I will say, if do we have any more time? I think we're over time, right?
We're
Yes.
almost done. We have anything to add? By all means, yeah.
I have so much to add. I think we'll continue later because there are so many very important
right.
questions they had. So I would maybe get
We
to
should
it.
bring this to a close because I think the recording executive will say, "Shut it down." Yes, sir. So contractually, we have to leave this room now. But I hope everyone will agree that Sandipto has given a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
And this is a profoundly
Thank you for
important
your-
book. And thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for writing it.